Hey folks, Erick Stakelbeck here. Welcome to a Watchman Newscast live stream, but not just any live stream. We are joined today by a very good friend. David Rubin is with us from Jerusalem. Hey, it's a cold night, a chilly night in God's holy city, and David is braving the elements. He's outside at TBN's Jerusalem studio. He's got some great insights to share. He's going to tell us all about an organization that is near and dear to my heart, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and much more. David Rubin, welcome to the Watchman. Great to see you again, my friend.
Well, thank you, Eric. Good to be with you.
Hey, we have a lot to talk about, and you and I have known each other for quite a while now, and we've always been able to just have you on various programs, David, and you don't mince words, number one, which is what I love. We live in times where it is no time to mince words. But number two, you're bringing the straight story from Israel's biblical heartland. Folks, David was the mayor of Shiloh in Samaria, the ancient biblical city of Shiloh. In the West, many people pronounce it Shiloh. In Israel, they call it Shiloh. David was the mayor there, and much more. We're going to talk all about your life, your work in Israel, and of course, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, an incredible organization that we encourage everyone to get behind. But David, first, I got to ask you, you're in Jerusalem. We just had an election in Israel. There are the coalition talks right now. Benjamin Netanyahu is set to become prime minister once again. What are your thoughts on this new Israeli government, and what can we expect going forward?
Well, one thing that's for sure, Eric, is that it's very exciting. There is not one person who is not excited about it, whether they're excited in a positive way or excited in a negative way. And that includes everyone from the far left in Israel to the Arabs in Israel to the right wingers in Israel, and of course, people as far away as Washington, D.C., who are quite upset about it. And the reason is because this is going to be the first conservative government that Israel has ever had. Yeah. Okay, and this is something that's not being pointed out by a lot of people. It is the first conservative government. Well, people might say, well, okay, Netanyahu is conservative, isn't he? And, well, Netanyahu is right of center. And he has always brought in his past terms, he has always brought in a strong left-wing party into the government and appointed the head of that party, whether it was Benny Gantz or Ehud Barak, he would always appoint him as defense minister, which is the number 2 position in the government. So this time he wasn't able to do that because it is a total right-wing majority, if you include the Likud, which, as I said, the Likud is Netanyahu's party. It's right of center. Mm-hmm. And in a 120-seat Knesset or parliament, you need to have a majority of more than 60 seats. Well, he got 64 this time. The right-wing parties joined with him, and together they make 64.
Yeah, and you've got to look, as you said, David, across the board, conservative parties in this coalition. There's no left-wing party. It is for once a coalition that is ideologically aligned, it seems, right? For the most part.
For the most part, there are differences. There is, as I said, Netanyahu's Likud party has half of the coalition numbers. They're exactly half, 32 out of 64. And they're primarily a secular party, right of center, yes, but secular. Whereas the other parties are religious parties, ranging from the religious Zionist party to the ultra-Orthodox parties. And together, there is a lot of common ground, and I think it's going to be a very cohesive government, actually.
Yeah, it would seem they would have a better chance to stay together than previous governments where it's so far flung ideologically. I think that Naftali Bennett led government, I think there was 8 different parties that comprised it. It was bound to fall apart, including left-wing parties. Hey, folks, if you are just joining us, we have a very special guest from Jerusalem, our good friend David Rubin, founder of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. We're going to talk all about it tonight. And David, we're going to hear your personal story in a minute. I have one last question about the government because you know it so well. And hey, a former mayor of Shiloh, Israel, you mentioned Washington, D.C. and the anger here in the U.S. You're a New York native. You've been in Israel for many years now. You made Aliyah decades ago, but born and raised in New York City. So you know the U.S. and the U.S. Israel relationship very well. Why do you think Washington, D.C. is so upset? I think of a guy like Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, some of the figures in the new government, and it seems like it's going to be very interesting going forward, needless to say, with how the Biden administration deals with this new Israeli government.
Right. Well, there are a few issues going on here. First of all, the question of what is going to be with the so-called West Bank, which we call the biblical heartland of Israel. Mm-hmm. If you look at it geographically, historically, we're talking about Judea, which is the region south of Jerusalem, Samaria, which is the region north of Jerusalem, where Shiloh is located, by the way. Mm-hmm. So that's the biblical heartland of Israel. That's Israel's historical heartland up in the mountains. And anyone who would even talk about giving it away, as the Biden administration wants to do, to create a Palestinian terrorist Muslim state in the heartland of Israel, in Judea and Samaria, that would be a tragic mistake. Tragic mistake for Israel and a tragic mistake for the United States, because the United States would lose its strategic partnership with Israel. So you have to understand, when Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, came out with this statement that it would be a tragic mistake for Israel to not go for a 2-state solution with the Palestinian terrorist state. Well, I think he's way off base. And hopefully the Israeli government will have the fortitude and the unity that it will be able to stand up to Anthony Blinken and Biden's other advisors.
Yeah, it seems like we could be heading for a diplomatic collision course. We shall see, David. Hey, folks, write this down, type it in your phone, israelchildren.org/Rubin. You see the URL there on your screen for the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. I've been mentioning it so far. Now David is going to tell us about it. Real quick, a quick reminder before he does, we will have a Q&A session at the end of this live stream, the last 15 minutes or so. So be sure to send your questions in here on the live chat. David, we got people joining us from around the world, I see right now, and David is with us in Jerusalem, God's one and only holy city. Okay, David, Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. Tell us about it, number one, and then we will talk about your personal journey and why you formed this organization.
Okay, Eric. Well, look, about a year after my term as mayor of Shiloh, I was driving back from Jerusalem with my 3-year-old son buckled behind me in the baby seat. And we're about halfway home. Suddenly the car was hit with a massive hail of bullets. The car went completely dead when the bullets hit. There were terrorists on the side of the road, we later found out, who had Kalashnikov assault rifles. That's an AK-47 by American terms. And they were shooting. I saw 3 orange sparks fly past me. Apparently the bullets had tracers on them. And then I felt one crash into my left leg. The car was completely dead. It had stopped. And I quickly turned around to my son as the bullets are flying. And I asked him if he was okay. And his eyes were staring straight ahead. Remember, he's 3 years old. His eyes were staring straight ahead wide open. His mouth was wide open. He looked like he was trying to scream or cry, but no sounds were coming out. But I could see that he was breathing. So I figured he was just in shock. I better start the car as fast as I can, get away from these terrorists. I turned the ignition. The car wasn't starting. I shifted gears. And meanwhile, blood was pouring out of my left leg from a bullet that had crashed into my lower leg. And I turned the ignition again. I shifted gears, drive, park, neutral, everything I could to get the car to start. It wasn't starting. Then suddenly it started, and it started as if it had never had a problem starting before. I hit the gas. I drove as fast as I could. I was going 170 kilometers an hour. That's about 110 miles an hour to get away from the terrorists. The whole time, my whole body was shaking, probably from loss of blood. The car was shaking, probably from the speed I was going. But I managed to get within 2 to 3 minutes. I got up to the community up the road, the next community. I pulled up to the front gate. And you have to understand, in Samaria, all of the communities have a metal gate in the front of the community to keep out car bombers. So I start shouting to the guard at the gate, ambulance, ambulance, please get an ambulance. I couldn't get out of the car because of my leg, which was bleeding profusely. And someone started jumping up and down. This woman on the side of the road starts screaming to the guard at the gate, ambulance, don't you hear? And everyone who was within sound reach then came running to the car. The gas station attendant from across the street ran up to my car. He ripped off my shirt. He wrapped up my leg to stop the blood flow. He said, don't worry, I'm also a paramedic. I know what I'm doing. And he handed me his cell phone. He said, quick, call your wife. I couldn't dial. My hand was shaking too much. He dialed it for me as he's holding my leg tight. And I told my wife I've been shot in the leg, and hopefully soon they'll be taking me to the hospital and our son is okay. Well, he wasn't okay because about 30 seconds later, the ambulance did pull up and 2 paramedics leaped out of the ambulance. One of them unbuckles him from the seat and pulls him out of the car and starts shouting to the ambulance. He's also been shot. He's been shot in the head. That a bullet had gone into his head where the skull meets with the neck, causing a skull fracture and internal bleeding in the cerebellum. Well, they wrapped his head with bandages, put an oxygen mask on his face, and whisked us both on stretchers into the hospital, into the ambulance, which took us to the hospital in Jerusalem, where I was pronounced the 1,000th victim of terrorism, to be hospitalized in that hospital in just a year and a half of that second, what the Palestinians, so-called Palestinians, called the Intifada.
And by the way, David, this incident occurred on December 17th, 2001, nearly 21 years ago to the day. Today is December 7th. Unbelievable. That's right. But please continue. Your 3-year-old son. Okay,
so he was put in a separate emergency room. He was in intensive care for several weeks. And thank God he recovered. Thank God he recovered. The bullet that went into his head and through his neck missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. And he survived. He survived, and we both survived, thank God. But what came out of that whole experience is not just a lot of trauma and not just a commitment to make sure that we can do some good, that some good can come out of this. What came out of it was an amazing story of miracles that people started to ask me about. But concurrent with telling the story of the miracles, my son was going through a lot of trauma. And my wife realized that, and I realized that, and we had to do something about trauma. And there was no way, what do you do? What does a parent do with a 3-year-old who's going through trauma? Yeah. And so we tried to find some sort of therapeutic program. There was nothing. And then I started exploring it, and I found out that quite a few of his friends had been through similar traumas. One whose brother was killed in a terror attack, another whose brother was killed in a terror attack also, another one whose father had been wounded in a shooting. And I just realized, that there was just this vision in front of my head, in front of my eyes, that spoke of a therapeutic educational campus. Somehow there's something has to be done for such a time like this, where we're dealing with such traumas and children are dealing with such traumas. And that's when I decided to start what would eventually become the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund for the purpose of healing the trauma of the terror victim children and restoring some of that lost innocence to their lives.
Yeah. David, this was 21 years ago, the incident, yet we still have terror, and we have an ongoing terror wave today in Samaria. 21 years later, a whole new generation of young Israeli kids, toddlers, are experiencing the same horrific, traumatic situations and scenarios, victims of terror. The list just goes on. I've been, folks, to Shiloh with David. I've seen the work he's doing at the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. It's absolutely cutting edge and amazing. I've seen the smiles on the children's faces, David. You're changing lives. Tell us about what you do at the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. We hear the need, obviously. It's sad that there's such a need, but it is a very pressing need for the people of Israel, in particular in the biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria. You just shared your absolutely extraordinary personal story. And I want to come back to that, David. And you mentioned miracles. We're going to talk a little bit about how God's hand of provision was there for you and your son in that dark moment. Yeah. But tell us about some of the things you do at the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And by the way, folks, again, israelchildren.org/Rubin. Great organization. You want to bless Israel? You want to fulfill that biblical mandate to bless the people of Israel, the Genesis 12:3 mandate? I can't think of a better way than to partner with the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. But David, tell us more for everyone watching around the world. Tell us more about what exactly you do.
Okay, well, first of all, you pointed out accurately that the terrorism has been having quite a resurgence recently, and there are more terror victims already in 2022 than there were in 2008, which was the previous peak of the terrorism. And then it was slowly going downhill for a number of years, and it was reduced. There was always terrorism, but it's peaking again.
Getting worse.
So we're dealing with this right now. And what we do, Erick, is that we have created these points of therapy, points of treatment. So we have a horse farm for therapeutic horseback riding. We have music therapy. We have art therapy. We have bibliotherapy and sports therapy. And we have multi-sensory safe room therapy. All of these therapies combine to heal trauma. Now, what do we actually do? It's not having a child learn to play an instrument, even though we do that also through the educational programs. But that child is going to reenact the trauma that he or she has been through. And through that, a bridge is built between the child and the therapist, and the child learns to contend with the terrorism, learns to move on, learns that everything happens for a good reason. Now, we have an expression in Hebrew, hakol l'tovah, and what it means, it sounds like it's saying everything is for good. But specifically, it means everything happens for a good reason. And we help the children to find that reason. We help the child to see the light in the darkness and to move on with his or her life. And that's in a nutshell, that's what we do. And whether we're doing it, Erick, whether we're doing it through music or whether we're doing it through art or horses, or our petting zoo, the small animals. It's all working to help the child to contend with the trauma and to move forward.
Yeah, you talk about lost innocence of these poor young kids, David. You and I have both been shot. We were talking before the interview. Hey, it was traumatic enough for us as adults to go through that, but a 3-year-old like your son, 10-year-old kids, 14-year-old kids, and kids who aren't only being wounded themselves, David, in acts of terror, but seeing their loved ones killed, their brothers, their sisters, their mom, their dad, sometimes in front of their eyes by Palestinian terrorists. Tell us more about the kind of kids you get.
The focus is on healing trauma. Okay, so we accept children who are suffering from other traumas as well. It's not just the terrorism. But as I always explain it to people, the children in Shiloh and the children who come from the surrounding areas of Samaria for treatment in our center, these children suffer from all the same traumas that children suffer from around the world. Whether it's a trauma of child abuse or the trauma of a parent becoming terminally ill or a trauma of divorce. These are all traumas that children around the world suffer from. But on top of that, we have the trauma of war and the trauma of the threat of war, the ever-present threat of war, the trauma of having terrorist organizations with 150,000 missiles pointed at Israeli cities, and Israel being a country about the size of the American state of New Jersey, that's a pretty real threat. And then we have, in addition to that, the threat of terrorism and the very real terrorism. So there is not a child who has not had every single child in Shiloh and in the surrounding communities in Samaria has either been wounded himself or herself in a terror attack, or had a parent killed or wounded, or a sibling killed or wounded, or a friend or a neighbor or a teacher killed or wounded in a terrorist attack. So the level of PTSD, of post-trauma stress disorder, is extraordinarily high.
Yeah, every child, David.
Every child. And that's why I said very clearly that something was needed, something different was needed for such a time like this.
Yes.
And that's why I had that vision of therapy and education, fusing the two, blending the two together in a very integral sort of way. And that's what we do. We have formal therapy programs that I noted. We have informal therapy programs, and we have group therapy programs in addition to the individual therapy.
Yeah, for these precious, precious little ones, David. I truly believe, and I know you believe this too, that God planted this vision for the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund on your heart for such a time as this, turning a horrific, what could have been a horrific tragedy. Thank God it wasn't. You and your son both lived. You're thriving. But God took it and he's making something good out of it now, blessing the children in the biblical heartland. Again, folks, israelchildren.org/Rubin if you want to partner and learn more about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. We're also going to talk about your books. We have to talk about Confronting Radicals. That's a big one, very timely here in the United States where I'm sitting right now. We're going to talk about that as well, David. Take some questions at the end too, folks. We've got people again from around the world joining us. But a twofold question before we move on to the books. Number one, tell us how you wound up in Israel. Years ago, you made Aliyah. You were living in New York City. You made Aliyah. You became the mayor of an ancient biblical city, the city of Shiloh. Many pronounce it here in the States as Shiloh. How did that all happen? And then we want to hear about the miracles on the night of December 17th, 2001, when you and your son were shot, yet you survived.
Okay, well, look, I grew up, Eric, as a sometimes atheist in a place called Brooklyn that you may have heard of. and as 30 years ago, 30 years ago as part of a process of return to Jewish roots. And I just came to the understanding that, number one, Israel is important. Number two, I started to learn about prophecies. And in reading the book of Ezekiel, specifically book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, I was completely sold. I just said, wow. It says that the people of Israel are going to be exiled from their land by their enemies, the Romans, and 2,000 years we're going to be scattered around the world and persecuted and slaughtered by the millions, and in some cases we'll be successful, but we're going to suffer greatly during that exile. And at the same time, simultaneously, the land will lay fallow. The land of Israel will not give of its fruit. It will be a barren desert. And indeed it was. Mark Twain spoke about it when he visited Israel about 150 years ago. Spoke about it, wrote about it. And then the people of Israel started coming back to the land of Israel, and the desert started blooming again. Well, I had my personal return that came some years later, in which I returned to the land of Israel. I've been living here 30 years, and every day is a privilege, Erick. Every day is truly a privilege to walk up and down the same hills where Samuel the prophet walked, and his mother Hannah came to pray, and where Joshua spoke to the Israelites even before that, and said, "How long will you wait before coming to take possession of the land that the Lord God of your fathers has given you?" So I'm very conscious of that. I'm very aware of that. And that awareness and that story has been told in all the times when I've gone to America, to Europe, to other places, speaking in churches, speaking to groups and congregations about what is really happening here in the biblical heartland of Israel, and talking about the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, yes, and the challenges that we face, and trying to encourage people to stand with us. But as a result of that, I started writing books. Mm-hmm. And I was actually encouraged by a particular Christian Zionist woman. And as we're standing under the dome of the capital city of California, of all places, in Sacramento, mm-hmm. and she said, "David, when are you going to write the book?" And I said, "What book? I've never written a book before." She said, "The book. You have to write the book about the terrorism, about all the challenges Israel faces. Share your testimony of the miracles, and tell about what is really happening in the heartland of Israel." And I've been doing it ever since, Erick. I've been telling that story, and I've been talking about a lot of other things, about the challenges, the dual challenge to Israel and to Judeo-Christian civilization. And how we need to be standing together in these times, because the forces of rabid secularism and perversion of the traditional family, and all these challenges that we face with the assault coming from the other side, from the Islamic ideologues, from the Muslim Brotherhood, from the Palestinians and their terrorist organizations. All of this is happening simultaneously, and Erick, we Jews and Christians need to be standing together in these times to meet those challenges. And that's what I've been writing about. And as you mentioned, my most recent book is called Confronting Radicals: What America Can Learn from Israel.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the newscast a few months ago, folks. You can find it here in our archives. I want to talk about that, David, real quick. Just a quick mention. I was in Shiloh with you a few years ago. And you said this is where the tabernacle once stood. The Ark of the Covenant rested in Shiloh. Was it 382 years, David?
369 years.
369 years.
Which is more than any place in the land of Israel, far more than any place in the land of Israel besides Jerusalem.
Yes. So a very special place, to say the least. You think of Eli, the high priest there. We saw what was most likely his home. You showed us during our visit to Shiloh, and you had the privilege of being the mayor of that ancient biblical city. And prophetic times, you mentioned, David, you said it. You mentioned Ezekiel 36, an incredible chapter about God's promises to the people of Israel. We are living in prophetic times right now, and you're a true watchman on the wall, and you showed that again in your book, Confronting Radicals. Hey, right now, and this is coming. Hey, you're born and raised in the U.S. You've been in Israel for 30 years, but you know the U.S. very well, of course. Yep. And you see what's unfolding here in the United States, the violent riots, all the rest, especially in the summer of 2020. It was really out of hand. We still see it flaring up. Israel knows how to deal with this, internal unrest. It does it all the time. So what can Americans learn from Israel right now, as we here where I'm sitting right now in the United States, as we are confronting radicals who want to tear down the very traditions, the very history, the foundations of this nation?
Right. Well, they do. And, when I wrote the book, Confronting Radicals, What America Can Learn from Israel, I wrote it as a reaction to the riots that were going through the streets of America. And they were called at first the George Floyd peaceful protests. Mm-hmm. But we soon realized that it was so much more than that. And Israelis were coming up to me as somewhat of an authority on the United States. And they were saying, David or David, what is going on in America? It sounds like America is self-destructing. You'd see in New York City, Macy's department store, all boarded up. The bricks on the street corners of Manhattan. And those bricks were being used to take and throw at the police, to throw through store windows, to assault officials of the United States government in government offices. I said, wait a second, this is too much deja vu here. Mm-hmm. And they were throwing Molotov cocktails at the police, which are these homemade firebombs that have wounded so many Israelis. And I said, no. What's going on here? There is a parallel between what is happening in Israel and what is happening in America. And it was just so obvious. And I realized that I had to research this and really study this so that I could share with my friends in America what we Israelis have learned that we can share with America that will help America to confront these radicals. And when I say confront these radicals, I'm not just talking about going out and physically fighting with them. I'm talking about structurally at the grassroots level to confront what they're doing, because essentially they are trying to bring down Judeo-Christian civilization, not just to go out and protest about race and gender and all kinds of things like that. It is an attempt to destroy what has been built over many years. And that too in Israel, we have experienced that with this Islamic ideologue assault on Israel as God's nation that has returned to its land. So I say learn from our successes, but also learn from our mistakes.
Yeah.
For instance, Erick, we were a socialist nation when Israel was first reestablished as a country in 1948. And it took about 30 years for us to get out of it. But one thing that we saw from that socialism is that when you have socialism as an economic system, you're also going to have the reduction of freedom. Because for those first 30 years of the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, that is, we had one labor union, we had one health fund, and we had one television station. And they were all controlled by the Israeli government, which was a socialist left-wing party.
The Labor Party.
That's right. And then when Menachem Begin came in 1978, and he realized, this had to be done away with. Israel needed to be opened up. And he and President Ronald Reagan joined together, they joined hands, and they made up a plan, and they worked together to free Israel from socialism. And now Israel, as you know, as most people know, is a thriving free market economy. And all of those other freedoms came back as well. There are plenty of labor unions, and there are lots of television stations and radio stations where people have free speech. So it can be done here, and it's important that America not go down that road.
I want to ask you more about that in a second, David. But folks, do you like what you're hearing? This seems like common sense in times where common sense is not so common. Then you will love David Rubin and his book, Confronting Radicals. Now, if you're just joining us, David is with us coming from Jerusalem on a chilly night in God's city. He's been kind enough to join us for the full hour on this live stream. If you missed any of this live stream, key point here, the entire live stream will be on the channel. As soon as we wrap up, we will post the entire 1 hour of the stream under newscasts. You'll see it on the home page, but you got a twofer here, folks. Right in time for Christmas, for Hanukkah, the holidays are upon us. Number one, if you want to support David's great organization, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And number two, if you want to pick up his great book, Confronting Radicals, which we're talking about right now, just go to israelchildren.org/Rubin. You see the URL there on your screen, and you will find out all the information you need about the Children's Fund and also the book, Confronting Radicals, and all of David's books. Confronting Radicals is just the latest. He wrote a book called, was it Trump and the Jews, or The Jews and Trump? That's a fascinating one, David.
Trump and the Jews.
Trump and the Jews. Folks, are you intrigued? Would you like to pick that up? Also, Islamic Tsunami is a great book, and there's many more that you've written. But let's key on Confronting Radicals right now still, David, because it is your latest. And before we go to Q&A, reminder, folks, we will have questions and answers here. Last 15 minutes or so, we're getting there. So before we go to Q&A, I do want to hear about the miracle factor in the incident, David, a near-death experience, I could only call it, with you and your son almost 21 years ago. But talking Confronting Radicals now, obviously the traditions, tradition is key. Israel, over 3,000 years of tradition, the Jewish people in the land of Israel. The U.S., obviously not as much history here, but it seems that this so-called woke movement, we talk about confronting radicals. The radicals today call themselves woke here in the United States. It seems that a key in fighting back is preserving the heritage, everything that's good and true about your nation, whether it's Israel or the U.S. How much do Israelis cling to that as they stand strong and united against the onslaught that, as you mentioned, would like to destroy Judeo-Christian civilization? And why is it so important for Americans to remember that shared history and shared destiny as well?
Well, look, if you want to understand what's happening in America, so you have to look at Israel. I just shared with you about the socialism and learning from our big mistake with that. Well, we've had other mistakes, of course, and you cannot appease terrorists, you cannot appease those who are trying to destroy your society. And when I saw statues, monuments to American heroes being destroyed, and I was very, very concerned, because that's the basis. You know, the foundation on which a country stands is its heroes. You know, in Israel, you don't see anyone tearing down the sign on King David Street, because King David was the great king of the unified Israeli kingdom. You don't see people setting on fire the tomb of Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern Zionism, and you don't see people setting on fire the King Solomon Hotel, for example. I'm giving you examples.
Yeah,
you have to understand that a country stands on its foundations. If you remove those foundations, you destroy your country. Right. And that's something that America must not do. Now, in Israel, we are standing with tradition. Israel is becoming a more and more traditional country, and that's one reason why we've had this recent election where we have a fully conservative government, fully conservative coalition. And that's something that can happen in America again. And I want to remind people, and the socialism story that I shared with you is so that you understand that no change is irreversible. And from the 60s, the left-wing radicals have been working at the grassroots level to get control of school boards, to get control of the media, to get control of the legal system. And that can be undone, just like it was undone here. And that's important for Americans to be aware of.
Yeah, that's encouraging too, David. I think really in the United States, we could use a Josiah, a leader with a vision like Josiah, some revival, some rebirth here. Folks, America has a problem, a sickness called wokeism, radicalism. Dr. David Rubin, he's an honorary doctor here in the Watchman Newscast for the evening. He's got the prescription in his book, Confronting Radicals. Again, if you want to pick it up, just go to israelchildren.org/Rubin. It is a great book for such a time as this. That goes without saying. Again, David lays out, hey, we're talking about the problem. We know we have left-wing radicals trying to destroy the foundations of America and Israel and the Western world. David lays out some very common sense solutions that are feasible. They are attainable if only we wake up as a society. Again, it is israelchildren.org/Rubin. And if you're just joining us, you might say, what's the Israel Children piece to all this? David, before we go to questions, you told just a powerful, powerful personal story earlier here in the newscast. And again, folks, if you missed anything, check it out here in our archives under newscast for the full live stream. But David, you laid out December 17th, 2001, you and your then 3-year-old son were shot in a Palestinian terror attack, ambushed in your car as you're driving along the road. Miraculously, you both lived. You're thriving today. You mentioned miracles in relation to that incident. I believe clearly God was in the founding of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, which we're talking about today. But give us, before we go to the Q&A, could you share one or two at least of the miraculous happenstances around that incident on December 17th, 2001?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the car was completely dead. The terrorist was shooting, and I was shot in the leg. My son had been shot in the head. We later found out, and the bullet had gone through his neck. Well, the bullet missed his brainstem by 1 millimeter. So there's miracle number one.
That's right.
The bullet that shot me in my leg, that crashed into my leg, it was my left leg that was hit. Even though the terrorist was shooting from the right side, it missed my right leg, which enabled me to drive my automatic car to get to that ambulance.
Wow.
Well, there were other miracles. It missed the main nerve in my leg. So I had nerve damage, but not something that would prevent me from walking. But the main miracle was that I get a call from the car mechanic on my 5th day in the hospital, and he tells me that we have the car. There are 49 bullet holes in the car. It's going to be very difficult to fix, but we're going to do our best. And I said, I don't really care about the car anymore. The car's not important. My son was in the intensive care unit. He was sleeping most of the day from the bleeding in his cerebellum. He could hardly lift himself up in his bed. He had almost total memory loss. And that's what I was concerned about. That's what I was very concerned about.
Of course.
And so the car mechanic tells me, David, I just have to ask you, why can't we start that car? Now, I know the car went dead when the bullets hit. I know I drove 110 miles an hour to get to that ambulance. And I also know that the car was dead at that point, and they had to have it towed afterwards because they couldn't get it started, and the car mechanics couldn't get it started.
Yeah.
And at that point, I just realized that we had been touched by God, and that he had just lifted us up on his wings to get us to that ambulance and to safety, because apparently he had a higher purpose in mind. And which brings us, of course, back to the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund and everything that we're able to do, and all the wonderful people around the world who stand with us, who go into the website and who go into the link and they donate and they stand with us, they partner with us. And that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah, folks, I can't think, number one, of a worthier cause, a worthier way to fulfill that biblical mandate, Genesis 12:3, to support Israel, stand with the people of Israel. It's Christmas time. Hanukkah's almost upon us. It's a season of giving, no doubt. I can't think of a better way to close out the year than to support and to stand with the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. As David mentioned, look, they are taking children who are victims of terror. And practically every kid in Samaria, as David mentioned earlier, is a victim of terror, if not directly, then indirectly. A family member, a friend, a loved one affected, injured, murdered in terror attacks. The Shiloh Israel Children's Fund is providing the kind of treatment these kids won't get anywhere else. IsraelChildren.org/Rubin. IsraelChildren.org/Rubin. You see the information there on your screen. And I mentioned earlier, it's a twofer because also at that link, you can find all of David's great books, including his latest Confronting Radicals, which we just discussed. David, those miracles are heartening. Clearly, God had, in the horrific incident almost 21 years ago to the day, God did have a higher plan and a higher purpose. And out of the ashes of that terror attack, he's doing something wonderful today in the form of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. Hey, my friend, if you don't mind right now, we're going to take a few questions from our viewers. Folks, again, we've got a few minutes left here. We've got almost 15 minutes left. Send in your questions for David Rubin. He's joining us from Jerusalem. Not only is he the founder of a great organization, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, but he is a top Middle East and terrorism analyst who speaks from personal experience. So send in those questions. David, here's one for you.
Okay.
This is interesting. The rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, which I know you're hearing about in Israel. Anita D asks, how can we confront what is happening to the Jewish communities in America? It seems like the administration right now isn't really listening, but what about this anti-Semitic wave here in the United States?
Well, people need to stand up against it, and stand up against it being honest about it. You know, the problem is that about a year and a half ago, when all these riots were happening, 2 years ago already, there was a lot of anti-Semitism that arose from that. And the unfortunate reality is that in certain parts of the Black community in America, there is tremendous anti-Semitism. And if you look at all of the attacks, and there have been a lot of anti-Semitic attacks in New York City alone, and in Brooklyn alone, which is where I was born and raised. And it's always Black people attacking Jews. Yeah. And, so I know that there's anti-Semitism coming from a lot of places. I know that there is anti-Semitism from the far right, and it does exist. But the bulk of the anti-Semitism today is on the far left.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to stand up to it, and we need to be clear about that this whole interdenominational nonsense and this whole this whole argument that, well, you could be against Israel's very existence, and you could be against the Israeli government on every single issue and not be an anti-Semite. It's nonsense. Israel is the only Jewish country in the world where we're surrounded by a mass of Muslim countries, some of them very radical, that want to destroy Israel and have 700 times the landmass of our tiny little country. And so when someone stands up and says, or does his Twitter bit and says that Hitler was right, well, I think that people need to, if they have any moral conscience left, they need to stand up to that. And unfortunately, too many people on the left have been looking the other way.
Yeah.
And it's not an accident that you had Kanye West and Nick Fuentes, seemingly on the right, on the far right, and West seemingly West seemingly not on the right or falling, not knowing where he is really.
Right.
And, there are definitely mental health issues there.
Yeah.
So I feel bad for him on one hand. On the other hand, he's speaking blatant anti-Semitic nonsense that is right out of the guidebook of Louis Farrakhan and his Nation of Islam. So these people need to be stood up against. And those who stand with Israel and stand with the Jewish people, I don't care if they're on the right or the left, they need to be standing strong and delivering a moral message, because the anti-Semitism in America is way out of proportion. Yeah. And I would encourage Jews in America also to wake up very quickly about what is really happening, and to understand that if you're not standing with Israel, you don't have to move to Israel like I did, even though I think it's a great thing to do. But you have to stand with Israel, and everyone in America and around the world who understands the importance of the state of Israel needs to be standing with Israel in these times.
Yeah, and the Jew haters now, David, they say, look, I don't hate the Jews. I'm just anti-Zionist. I'm not anti-Semitic. That's the new rhetoric, the new way they try to couch it. Hey, shifting gears a bit, this is a topic that we hear about, we're asked about a lot here on the channel, the Third Temple. Are we getting closer to the Third Temple where you're sitting right now, perhaps even behind you in that shot, the Third Temple in Jerusalem? Does this new government perhaps bring us a bit closer to that? Perhaps even Jews praying on top of the Temple Mount one day in the not so distant future?
Well, Jews already are praying on the Temple Mount. They kind of do it quietly, but there is no official synagogue up on the Temple Mount yet. It's going to happen in time, and it's a gradual process. It's a process of education. As Israelis start to or continue to move closer and closer to their heritage, which is a process that is happening. And as I told you, Israel, the families of Israel the traditional family is getting stronger and stronger in Israel, even though you have the far left aggressive LGBTQ people. But you also have this move towards Jewish heritage and tradition. And so yeah, we're moving in that direction, Eric. But it's a process of education. It doesn't just come down from the sky. It's a process of a lot of hard work and teaching and sharing. Yeah.
Prophetic times, David, as you mentioned earlier, no doubt. I think we have time for one more quick question, and we want to close out. I want some final thoughts, some final words of wisdom from David. And again, IsraelChildren.org/Rubin, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. That's the main focus of our conversation today. Okay, one last quick question, David. You can keep your answer short if you can, because we have a few minutes left and we want to talk about the organization one last time. This is kind of funny. Well, I know the answer to this already. Craig Janeway, good question, Craig. He says, what do you think about arming every Israeli of legal age and training them to defend Israel against enemies? I would argue that Israel already does that in the form of mandatory service in the IDF for men and women. But David, you can unpack that one real quick.
I would recommend that for Americans, in Israel, for everyone to have a gun license, he has to prove that he has need. He does have to have a license to carry. But once you have a license to carry, you carry unconcealed. And virtually every Israeli is a soldier, whether in reserve duty or, my 19-year-old son will be going into the army in a few months. Everyone, there's no family in Israel that does not have a soldier. And we believe in standing up for ourselves. And I should tell you, our educational therapeutic complex, our campus, does have a guard on all three sides of the campus, and each of those guards is armed, and we're happy that they are.
Yeah, and you encourage everyone to visit Shiloh. And in the States, some people call it Shiloh. In Israel, they call it Shiloh, ancient biblical city where, hey, the Ark of the Covenant was there, folks, for hundreds of years. The tabernacle, the place of meeting, God's divine presence dwelt in Shiloh. David was the mayor of Shiloh. What an honor. And you encourage everyone to visit, number one, David, and see the great work that the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund is doing up close, kind of hands-on.
Absolutely. And as you know, Eric, because you received the tour, I give that tour to visitors who come, as long as they get in touch with me in advance and we can schedule a morning. I'm happy to give that tour.
Yeah, folks, I strongly encourage that because we're talking about it today here on the live stream. Again, IsraelChildren.org/Rubin to partner with the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund to bless and to help these young kids in Israel who've been affected and in many cases wounded in acts of terrorism in Israel's biblical heartland, in Samaria, in Judea, kids from all over Israel, but in particular, the biblical heartland where the need is most acute. And whereas David mentioned earlier, we're seeing more terror now in 2022 than we did almost 15 years ago in 2008. That's pretty alarming. The need is there. And there's a need as for us, as the Christians who are watching right now, to stand with the people of Israel for such a time as this. And again, to fulfill that biblical mandate, Genesis 12:3, bless the people of Israel. I can't think of a better way to do it, especially during this season of giving. The holidays are upon us, than partnering with the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. And by the way, while you're there at the link, IsraelChildren.org/Rubin, pick up David's books, his latest, Confronting Radicals, many more. He tells his personal story, a survivor. He and his son, not victims, anything but victims. That's the great thing about David's story. He took something horrible. God took something horrible that happened to David and his son, and he's turned it into something wonderful in the form of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund. David, we got about 2 minutes left. Any final thoughts? You can speak from your heart. We're going to be praying for your son, by the way, your 19-year-old who's starting his service in the Israel Defense Forces in a few months. We're praying for your entire family, beautiful family, 6 wonderful kids. Your son, who was 3 years old when he was shot in the head, is now 24 years old. He's doing just fine, folks. So we're praying for you. And any final thoughts, David? And we can't thank you enough, by the way, for joining us today for the full hour here on the live stream.
Well, thank you. And I appreciate it, Eric. Look, there is no doubt in my mind that this is all about people working together, people partnering. And we rebuild the biblical heartland of Israel, and we strengthen our societies through partnership, through working together. And so just as Judeo-Christian civilization, and Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson spoke about it, how the Bible and the Jewish people and the Christians coming together, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
And that partnership is what we need to be working on today, to strengthen Judeo-Christian civilization, to strengthen Israel, to strengthen America, and to stand together. And as you said so accurately, by standing with the children of the biblical heartland of Israel, you are building for the next generations.
Yeah.
And there is no better way that a person can stand with Israel in our time. So I really want to just give my own appeal and just make it clear that that we rely on you. We're big Zionists, yes, and we believe in working the land and doing the hard work ourselves in building up Israel, rebuilding Israel again. But the fact is that the prophecies also speak about Christians standing with Israel. And if you know your Hebrew, you can look up in the book of Jeremiah, where it talks about how Christians are going to be standing with Israel, are going to be on Mount Ephraim, calling out to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and to stand with Israel. That's a true watchman who are standing with Israel in these times and doing it through the children.
Yeah, David, what a way to close. Couldn't have said it better, my friend. Hey, folks, you may have heard in the background a barking dog. David, you've got many fans, thousands and thousands of fans here at the Watchman live stream. You've also won the heart of my dog. He's upstairs barking and barking, so I apologize for that. But David, incredible stuff, my friend, as always. Again, folks, israelchildren.org/Rubin, the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund, and David's great, great books. For such a time as this, it goes without saying, David Rubin, it was great, my friend. Thank you much for joining us from Jerusalem. We'll see you again soon, my friend. And folks, thank you for joining us here in this very special live stream with David Rubin. Until tomorrow, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace. Hey everyone, thanks for checking out the Watchman Newscast. If you enjoyed this episode and want to see more, make sure you go ahead and hit the like button, click subscribe, and tap the bell icon to turn on notifications for new Watchman Newscast episodes every weekday.